Okay. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. It's nice to see you today.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. So, you've got two books. I see Bad Deal for America and I see The Decline of America. They seem to have a common theme. Which one's the new one? Is Bad Deal for America the new one?
Bad Deal for America, we actually timed them. Bad Deal for America was released on President's Day 2022, and The Decline of America was released on President's Day 2018. So Bad Deal is the more recent book, and both have a similar theme of Americans need to wake up and reform their government.
Okay. Well, I guess it begs the obvious question, what is wrong with our government?
Well, as they say, let me count the ways. My main concern was twofold in writing the first book, and it hasn't really moved away from that, which is that we need to get away from professional politicians. We need to have people who are actually real public servants go to Washington for limited periods of time, do the people's bidding, and then go home. And we're really not being served well by our government. And so, Decline of America focuses on failure in the White House, and then Bad Deal for America focuses on the failure in Congress, both houses of Congress.
Well, not to get too one sided politically, but I think if anybody recently was not a part of the Washington establishment, it was Donald Trump. And yet he was so, I don't know quite the word to use, because people either loved him or they hated him. It was one of the two. He didn't really have a lot of people down the middle. And yet he was somebody that I would recognize as somebody who took a baseball bat to the hornet's nest that's Washington, D.C. And while the general average American seemed to appreciate that, the Washington establishment did everything they could to get rid of him.
That's absolutely true. And it seems that we have this conundrum in Washington where we can elect people who are ruthlessly effective, which would be my term for Trump, and or pretty nice guys who are pretty ineffective, like Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to be anybody in between. And I am not a fan of Trump. I did vote for him twice. I'll just say that up front because he was the better of the two alternatives in both of his presidential elections. And his policies were good pro-American, pro-business policies. So if you vote for the policies, then you vote for Trump. But in terms of was he a good guy? I've never especially liked Trump. When I am not doing my university thing or writing, I'm a HR and employment law consultant, and I would never tell a client to say, "You're fired." That's not very effective. So going back to when he was doing the television show,
Right.
The Apprentice, and I thought there were a lot of flaws in that show. Also, of course, reports that he didn't pay all of his contractors and things like that, although a lot of that stuff was never sorted out. So it is a difficult challenge to find people who are really good leaders who have a good personal story as well as making good decisions for America.
Well, it brings up the question about which is more important, good policy or good personality. I'm not so sure that the President of the United States needs to necessarily have a great personality. He needs to be effective because, let's face it, the world is not a nice place. There are a lot of bad actors out there. We're seeing that unfold right now in the Ukraine. And there is absolutely no reason for anybody to be nice to Putin at this point.
Yes, I completely agree with that, and I know the general drift. And like I said, I agree with Trump's policies, which includes his foreign affairs. And as you know, there were a lot of weak countries like France that were very critical of Trump's leadership of America. And I think that was inappropriate. I think they were wrong. And for Trump to go out and say that people need to pay their bills to NATO, I'm, as an American taxpayer, I'm saying, you go, guy. That's what I want you to do. And so there's certainly, being tough in itself is certainly not a character flaw, but being, immoral or just politically incompetent is a flaw. And I would just say, and again, I do want to point out that my current book, Decline of America, my previous book does not cover Trump or Biden. It ended with the Obama administration. And so the new book that I'm working on will have chapters on Trump and Biden. So, of course, I've thought a lot about Trump. I've been interviewed about that before. But my point is that Trump was not a competent politician, and that cost him the election, and it cost the American taxpayers. I heard an estimate today that each American household is losing about $3,500 because of runaway inflation. And it seems to be directly tied to Biden, even though Biden did a speech today saying that it's all Putin's fault. Of course, he's been saying that about every other day. And the American public, the old cliche about fool me once and fool me twice, the American public's not buying it.
Does one need to be an effective politician to win the White House, and then as soon as they win the White House, they have to switch gears and be an effective president? It sounds like it's two different things.
Well, what I'm referring to is that I think Trump could have, if he'd been a sharper politician, and that includes having a better staff. And, one of the things that we've already been doing research for I would call it the Trump chapter, is that he had a very high turnover in his appointments in Washington. And of course, a number of those people then went out and did tell-all books that were not very favorable to him. And so what my point is I think it's very important that you be savvy enough to get reelected. And some of the things that I would just say, again, 2020 hindsight would have been to get out there and to police the elections in some of these corrupt areas where we know that there were some shenanigans going on. Now, I'm not prepared to say that cost him the election, but I certainly think that more could have been done. In other words, complaining after the election is not an effective political strategy. Taking action before the election was the strategy he should have taken. And I would have, as president of the United States, for instance, when Nancy Pelosi did not increase security at the Capitol, as Trump, I would either have canceled my appearance or I would have sent the National Guard personally to the Capitol and to the strip in between. I'm very familiar with Washington, by the way, having grown up in Virginia, and I did live in D.C. For several years in the early 2000s. And used to taking the metro and driving in and all that. And this just a small geographic area, it's just a few blocks. And I think that a smart politician would have done things differently. And that's my point, is you have to combine being smart with having good, effective policies. And that, of course, is the point of my second book, which is, Bad Deal for America, because the people in Congress are not there to help the American people. And so we need smart people, but we also need them to be beholden to us. And one of the proposals that I put in the new book is that they don't need to live in Washington, period. They do not need to live there. And we've proven that over the last 2.5 years with Skype and Zoom and all of these virtual things. And I want people to live under the laws that they're creating.
How would not living in Washington affect them in a positive way?
A lot of these politicians, especially, when it's election time, which for senators, again, is only 6 years, is 6 years apart. That's a long time between elections. And the Congress people have to show up. So what happens is they hang out in Washington, and then 30, 40 days as the polls open for early voting, they show up in their district and they run around and pretend to be, the ultimate representative of the American people. And the reality is that they're so disconnected from them. And many of them, you can just look at it, do not return. I'll use a specific example of someone I know personally, was Bill Archer, who was elected as chairman of Ways and Means. I was at his inauguration party in January of 1995 in Washington, D.C. So I'm reasonably close to the action there. And when he retired from Congress in 2000, he went over to a lobbying firm and made triple his salary that he had been making as a U.S. congressman. But he was a good guy. I think he had a lot of good policies, but I don't think he was connected to his district here in Houston, Texas.
Okay, well, that makes sense. I also am absolutely in favor of term limits for the rest of the government. I mean, when I see things that Nancy Pelosi has been in for 38 years, I think her time's up. And a long time ago, it was up.
You probably haven't had a chance to read my book, but we specifically barbecue Nancy Pelosi. We have a section in the back of the book that's dedicated for a couple pages just to her financial doings, but it's a very difficult situation. And the current book, Bad Deal for America, I specifically come out in favor of convention of states, because I don't think that the people in Washington are going to vote themselves out of power by putting in term limits. So I think term limits are absolutely essential across the board. And I favor, one term for president, probably 5 years, 2 terms for Senate, probably 2 5-year terms, not 2 6s. And for the Congress people, I'd say 10 years in Washington in the position as a U.S. congressperson. And as you know, we had a congressperson just pass away. He was getting ready up in Alaska. He was getting ready to run for his 25th term, and he passed away in his 80s. And, my comment is, I don't care whether the guy was great or not. He should have gone back to his district. He can run for mayor. He can run for governor. He can be dog catcher, or he can be just Joe average citizen. But to have anybody in Washington for 50 years is just ludicrous. And so, you've got Pelosi, who's in the 30-year category. These are not good people. These are not good situations for our American taxpayers.
No, and Biden is 47 years or something?
Yes,
Even
and that's
worse.
in my book. Biden, of course, is my book, The Bad Deal for America, is based on a deck of cards, and we feature 26 Republicans and 26 Democrats. But there was a joker card, and of course, that joker is Joe Biden.
Well, it sounds like an interesting book. David, unfortunately, we have to wrap this up. We are out of time. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have a website you want to give out?
We sure do. You can look up my books on Amazon. They're both available on Amazon, but I also have a consulting site. It's ClaremontManagementGroup.com, and people can get access to all of my material. And when I am quoted in the media, the links are put up on that site.
ClaremontManagement.com, did you say?
ClaremontManagementGroup.com.
Management Group, okay. All right, great. Well, thanks so much for coming on. I know we could have gone on for a lot longer.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for the invitation. Glad to do it.